The sky above the desert planet burned with red and orange colors as a human spaceship broke through the clouds with smoke trailing behind it like a dying dragon in the wind. The ship spun out of control after being hit by a sudden meteor storm that had torn its engines apart, and now it came crashing down on the dry land like a falling star inside the ship. Claire held on to her seat as alarms rang and metal screamed all around her, and her heart pounded with fear as she thought this would be the end. The impact shook the ground and sent dust flying for miles, and when it stopped, everything became silent, except for the soft crackling of fire and the weak sound of wind. Claire slowly opened her eyes. Her body hurt everywhere, but she was alive, and when she looked around, she saw the ship was broken and scattered, and there was no one else in sight. She stepped outside, dragging her injured leg behind her, and looked at the vast, dry land filled with strange black rocks, red sand, and tall, spiny plants that moved slightly as if watching her. She tried the emergency beacon, but it was dead, and the communication system was broken, and she was truly alone on a planet she did not even recognize from star charts she gathered some supplies from the ship like water packs, heat blankets, and a small toolkit, and made a simple shelter using metal sheets and broken panels to shield herself from the harsh winds. Night came quickly on this planet, and the cold bit through her bones, and far in the distance she heard a sound she could not explain, a deep clicking. Like stone hitting stone again and again, she sat in her shelter with her eyes wide open and a sharp tool in her hand, ready for anything, and the clicking stopped. After some time, but then came again, closer and slower. She did not sleep that night, her mind racing with questions and her body alert to every sound and every shadow that moved outside the thin metal walls of her shelter. In the morning, she found strange footprints near the shelter, big and round, with 3 claw marks, and she knew something had been watching her from the darkness. She decided to explore and maybe find water or shelter or signs of rescue, and she walked carefully across the land with the sun above her, so hot it made the air shimmer. She climbed a hill to get a better view and saw the remains of the ship spread across the valley below, and behind it, tall mountains touched the sky like sharp blades. Near the base of the hills she saw something strange, a group of strange green plants that looked moist and fresh, and maybe there could be water nearby. As she walked closer, she felt the air grow cooler, and the clicking sound returned louder, and now she could feel it in her chest like a warning. She froze and looked around, and then she saw it. A tall figure stood near the plants, its skin silver blue, its arms long, and its head shaped like a crown with eyes glowing faint green. It turned and looked at her, and she stepped back, her breath stuck in her throat and her hands shaking with fear. The creature did not move. It just stared at her with eyes that did not blink, and she could not read its face or guess its thoughts. Then it stepped forward slowly and made a low sound that felt more like a song than a word, and raised one hand, not in threat but in peace. Claire did not run. She stayed still, and the creature took one more step, then stopped and looked at the ground, then looked at her again. Something passed between them like a silent message that they were both not from here and both stranded in the same nightmare. The creature turned and walked away. Not fast, not slow, just calm, and vanished behind the rocky edge of the hill. Claire stood there for a long time, trying to understand what just happened and what that creature was and why it did not hurt her. She walked back to her shelter, her mind full of fear and curiosity, and that night the clicking sound returned once more, but it stayed far. She did not sleep again, but this time it was not only fear that kept her awake. It was something else, something she could not name yet. The morning sun rose with a soft red glow across the endless sky above the deserted planet, and Claire sat at the edge of her shelter with her knees close to her chest, her eyes fixed on the distant rocks where the strange alien had appeared the night before. Her thoughts were full of fear and questions and wonder as she held her tool tightly, her hand shaking slightly with the memory of the tall silver blue figure that had looked at her without anger or threat. She told herself it could be dangerous. It could be watching her from behind the hills, or waiting for nightfall to return. And yet she could not shake the feeling that it had let her go on purpose. She stood up, stretched her sore limbs, and grabbed the small water pouch hanging from her belt. The liquid inside was running low, and she knew she could not survive many more days without. Finding a new source with caution, she walked again toward the direction of the strange green plants she had seen near the hills, the same place where the alien had stood, the same place where the ground felt cooler and the air smelled different. Each step felt heavier than the last as the memory of the creature's glowing eyes haunted her, and her ears listened closely for that clicking sound that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. When she reached the plants, she knelt down and brushed her hand over the soft leaves, and to her surprise, her fingers touched wet soil underneath, which meant there was moisture and possibly water nearby. She looked around and saw no sign of the alien, so she pulled out her small digging tool and began to dig carefully until a shallow pool of clear water began to rise from beneath the dirt. She leaned forward, cupped her hands, and drank, slowly letting the cold taste fill her mouth and throat, and then sat back, wiping sweat and dust from her face with the sleeve of her jacket. The moment was calm, until she felt a shift in the air, like a breeze that carried no wind, and a sound echoed softly like a distant whisper that grew louder with each second she turned. And there it was again. The alien, closer this time, standing only a few feet away. Its skin shimmered under the sunlight, and its posture was upright, but not tense, and it made no sudden movement, just looked at her as it had before. Claire stood slowly, holding her hands up to show she meant no harm, and she said a word loud and clear, though she knew it would not understand. Hello. The creature tilted its head and repeated a sound that mimicked the tone of her voice, but with a strange echo that made it feel more like a breath than a word. She pointed to herself and said her name, slowly, Claire. The alien blinked, then pointed to its own chest and made a sound that echoed like Kovri. She repeated it, unsure if that was a name or a signal, but the alien responded with what looked like a nod. Claire stepped back slowly, and the alien stepped forward slowly, and they met in the middle near the pool of water, where silence felt heavy, but not hostile. She crouched down, dipped her hand in the water, and looked at Kovri, who then crouched too and did the same. And for a moment, they both stared at the ripples forming between them. A low growl broke the moment from behind the rocks to the left. Something large moved fast and loud, and Kovri jumped up, raising one long arm in front of Claire as a dark beast leaped out with sharp claws and burning red eyes. Claire screamed and stumbled back, but Kovri plunged forward, striking the creature with powerful arms, and strange light burst from his hands as he fought. The battle was fast, brutal, full of roars and blows, and when the dust settled, the beast lay dead, and Kovri stood over it, breathing hard and his silver-blue skin stained with dark blood. Claire looked at him in shock and fear, but also gratitude. And Kovri looked at her with a strange gentleness that made her feel safe in a way she did not understand. He stepped back slowly and pointed to the cave near the hill, as if asking her to follow, or offering her shelter, or warning her about danger. She hesitated, then nodded slowly, picking up her water pouch and walking with him side by side toward the cave. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows as they reached the entrance inside the cave. The air was cool and dry, and there were strange markings on the wall and soft moss growing along the stone like a bed. Kovri sat near the entrance, watching the outside, while Claire sat deeper inside, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders and listening to the wind outside change its tone. She wanted to speak, to ask, to cry, but all she could do was stare at the alien who had just saved her life and wonder what tomorrow would bring on this strange world where trust had to be built without words. The cave walls glowed faintly from the bioluminescent moss that clung to the surface like silent watchers and Bosch. And Claire sat in one corner with her arms wrapped around her legs, listening to the quiet hum of the planet outside as Kovri sat near the entrance like a guardian carved from stone. The night air was cooler here than outside, and she could finally breathe without sand in her throat, though the silence between her and Kovri felt heavier than the darkness itself her eyes kept. Drifting to him, trying to understand who or what he really was and why he had helped her without reason or words. She remembered the way he fought the beast. The way his body moved with skill and strength, but also restraint, as if he knew the creatures. Weakness from experience, Claire wanted to speak, but every time she opened her mouth, the words vanished like dust, and all she could do was sit in that cave, watching and wondering. When morning came, the first light crept across the cave floor like golden fingers, and Kovri stood slowly, his tall frame casting long shadows over her as he motioned for her to follow. She hesitated, unsure of what he wanted, but something in his eyes told her it was safe, or at least safer than staying alone, so she stood and walked behind him into the open. They moved across the rocks in silence, and Claire noticed that Kovri seemed to know this land well. He walked with purpose, pausing now and then to touch the ground or listen to the wind, as if reading the world like a book she could not see. They reached a ridge that overlooked a wide flat valley, and in the center was something unexpected. A small field of glowing blue stones, shaped in a perfect circle around a black spire that pulsed with a soft light. Kovri approached slowly and placed his hand on the spire, and for a moment the blue stones lit up one by one, as if waking from sleep. Claire stepped back, unsure of what was happening, but Kovri turned to her and made a gentle motion with his hand, and she realized he was showing her something, not threatening her. She stepped forward slowly and looked at the stones, and then at the spire, and saw strange symbols glowing on its surface, symbols that looked like both letters and stars. Kovri touched his chest, then touched the spire, and she understood this was his place, or at least a part of his past, maybe a home or a beacon. He touched one of the glowing symbols, and a faint image appeared in the air above the spire. It showed a ship, not hers, sleek and smooth, with curved wings and blue engines, and it floated above a different world, one filled with tall towers and wide oceans. Kovri looked at her, then touched his chest again, and she understood he came from somewhere far. He was also lost, stranded alone. She nodded slowly and pointed to the sky, trying to tell him she understood and that maybe they could help each other. Kovri lowered the image, and the stones dimmed, and then he began gathering pieces from the ground, strange metallic tools and crystal fragments, and placed them in a small bag made of woven plant fibers. They returned to the cave before nightfall, and Claire helped him arrange the items near the wall, organizing them by shape and color and purpose. Though she had no idea what they truly were, Kovri watched her and then did something unexpected. He picked up a small glowing crystal and handed it to her. It was warm in her hand, and when she held it closer to her chest, she felt a soft vibration like a heartbeat. She looked at him and smiled, and though his face did not change, she felt he understood. That night, they sat by a fire made from dry vines and heated stones, and shared a meal of roasted roots and dry leaves that Kovri had prepared. It was not much, but it was enough, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Not words, not promises, but understanding, trust. Claire leaned back against the cave wall, watching the flickering shadows on the ceiling, and thinking about how strange and beautiful this world was, so deadly, so quiet, so alive. She closed her eyes, listening to the crackling fire and the soft breathing of the alien beside her. And for the first time in many nights, she slept without fear. Kovri sat awake for hours, his eyes watching the entrance, his body still as stone, and when he looked at Claire, he saw not a threat, not an intruder, not an enemy. He saw someone like him, a survivor, a soul lost between stars. He placed one of the crystals near her as she slept and turned his gaze back to the night. The cave held their silence, like a promise, and far above the desert sky, the twin moons rose slowly, casting silver light on a new bond, forming in the heart of an empty world. Days passed like waves moving across dry sand, and Claire found herself falling into a rhythm she never thought possible on a deserted alien world, waking with the soft warmth of the twin suns, eating dried roots, and drinking from a slow, trickling spring. Inside the cave and walking the desert paths with Kovri by her side. Each day they ventured farther, learning to move as one, understanding each other with silent looks and hand gestures, and the rare sound that Kovri used for her name, Claire. Not perfect, not human, but it felt like comfort. She began to understand the planet in strange, small ways, like how the wind changed before a storm, or how the ground pulsed softly before a creature passed nearby, or how the moss inside the cave changed color when the air grew too dry. Kovri showed her how to find edible plants by slicing them and watching the sap, how to use glowing stones to warm their shelter at night, and how to listen with more than ears. Trust grew not with words, but with action. Claire once slipped on a rocky path, and Kovri caught her before she fell, pulling her close and steadying her with surprising gentleness. She laughed nervously, and he tilted his head as if unsure what the sound meant, but not displeased by it. That night she gave him one of her last protein bars, and he studied it like a gift from the stars, before carefully tasting it and nodding in quiet approval. Their world was silent, but it was alive. One morning they found a strange piece of metal buried in the sand, and Claire recognized it as part of her crashed ship. It was twisted and burnt, but inside it was something she had almost forgotten. A data chip. She grabbed it with shaking hands and turned to Kovri, her voice cracking. As she whispered the word hope, they brought it back to the cave, and Kovri examined it under a beam of sunlight, running his long fingers over the edges and humming a soft, low note that seemed to activate something. The chip glowed faint blue, and a small image projected into the air, a map. Stars coordinates. Claire gasped. This meant rescue. Maybe someday. Kovri looked at her face, saw the tears in her eyes, and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. They shared that moment like a spark in darkness, but survival came first. Storms began to grow more violent, and their food became harder to find, and the days became colder. They worked together, building a better shelter inside the cave, using rock layers and alien plant fibers to make stronger walls, and adding crystal lights that Kovri placed with precision. Claire created tools from ship fragments, turning metal panels into cooking plates and wires into snares to catch desert birds. One evening she returned to the cave with a fresh catch, only to find Kovri bleeding from his side, a gash deep and raw. His breathing was slow, and his skin duller than usual. Panic filled her chest. She dropped everything and rushed to his side, tearing strips from her own clothing to stop the bleeding and cleaning the wound with boiled water. Kovri made no sound, no cry, only looked at her with steady, tired eyes. She worked for hours, her hands shaking, her heart racing, and finally he slept. She sat beside him all night, refusing to rest. When he woke and saw her asleep with her head on his arm, he did not move. He simply watched her as the cave glowed around them with soft crystal light. Days later, Kovri began to heal. Slowly but surely, Claire smiled more. After that, she sang quietly while cooking and drew shapes on the cave walls using burned sticks and soft sand. One night Kovri brought her a gift. A carved piece of black stone, shaped like the twin moons. She held it close to her chest and whispered, "Thank you." Even though he might not know the word, but maybe he did. Their trust had become a bridge between two lost souls, stranded on a cruel and beautiful world. And as the stars shifted above them, Claire began to think that maybe this place was no longer just a prison. Maybe, just maybe, it could be a home. The planet breathed in silence, and each new dawn brought with it another small change in Claire's heart as she and Kovri moved through the days. Like two stars locked in the same sky, orbiting each other without speaking, but always understanding. Her fear had faded like a forgotten dream, replaced by a calm curiosity that bloomed like the soft glowing moss in the cave that now felt more like home than any place she remembered on Earth. Kovri had begun showing her new places, hidden paths, and caves filled with strange crystals that sang when touched, and plants that reacted to movement as if they could see. Claire watched him closely every time He moved his hands with care or paused to study a rock or placed a shield of crystal. Near their sleeping space, she found herself smiling without reason. Not because she had forgotten the danger, but because she had found peace in one deep valley. Kovri uncovered a buried panel from his own ship, and it hummed when he placed his palm upon it, glowing softly with a gentle pulse like a heartbeat. He turned to her and held out a small device no larger than her palm, and when she took it, she felt a vibration like a whisper in her skin. It projected light when pressed small symbols, danced in the air like floating fireflies, and Kovri touched them in a rhythm like music, and suddenly images appeared. Not just maps or stars, but memories. Claire saw his world for the first time, tall silver trees under 3 suns, creatures flying between towers made of living stone, oceans with waves that glowed under the night sky, and a city shaped like a spiral carved into a mountain. She looked at him with wide eyes and placed her hand on her chest. Beautiful. Kovri nodded slowly, as if the meaning had crossed the gap. She took the device and added her own memories. Her family, her childhood home, the green hills of Earth, the stars from her shuttle window, her voice recorded in a shaky whisper. "I am Claire." He listened to her voice. His head tilted slightly and repeated her name, softer now and clearer than before. Claire. She smiled. It was the first time it had sounded almost human. They began working together on repairing pieces of technology from both their ships, though nothing seemed strong enough to send a rescue signal, but each failure brought them closer. They began to understand gestures and emotions and the spaces between words. One night, as wind howled outside the cave, they sat beside each other, near the fire, their shoulders touching for the first time, not by accident, but by choice. Claire reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Kvi did not move away. His skin felt cool, but firm like stone, warmed by sun. He turned slowly and placed his hand on hers. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the fire, watching the shadows dance around them. Claire's dreams that night were strange, filled with swirling light, with stars falling through water, with Kovri's voice calling her name again and again. She woke with tears on her face and a feeling in her chest she could not name. In the following days, they continued to build together. They hunted, gathered, created tools, reinforced their shelter with layers of crystal and plant fiber, until the cave looked like a home designed by both human and alien hands. Claire began to laugh more, to hum while she worked, and sometimes Kovri joined her, making deep tones that echoed through the cave like an old song from the stars. Their bond was no longer just survival. It had become something deeper, a connection that defied shape or species or language. She often caught herself watching him when he was not looking, memorizing the curve of his back or the way his eyes glowed when firelight touched them. She felt safe in his presence, not just protected, but known. One evening, Kovri returned from the hills with a small fruit in his hand. He offered it to her. She took a bite and smiled at the sweet taste, and he watched her closely. Claire looked at him and whispered the word, "Thank you." He touched his chest, then hers, then said her name, Claire. She touched his arm and said his Kovri, and in that moment, something changed, not in the air, not in the cave, but in the space between their hearts, like a door opening without a sound, like a light turning on in a dark room, and neither of them looked away, not that night. Not ever again. Claire began waking up with a strange heaviness in her body, and a warmth that clung to her skin even before the twin suns rose, and the dreams that filled her nights had become louder, more vivid, full of color and echoes of voices that did not belong to Earth. She brushed them off at first, blaming the air or the food, or maybe the stress of survival, but each morning brought stronger waves of nausea and dizziness, and her heart beat with a rhythm she no longer understood. Kovri noticed the changes before she said a word, his eyes always scanning her movements, watching with concern every time she paused to rest or held her stomach in silence. He brought her soft, glowing leaves that helped calm her sickness, and strange berries that eased the heat in her skin, and though he never spoke his presence stayed closer than ever, never leaving her side. They no longer needed words to communicate. And yet, Claire felt an overwhelming need to tell him something was different, even if she did not know how to say it. She sat beside him one evening as the stars blinked in two view and took his hand, gently placing it on her stomach. His eyes met hers and stayed there unmoving, as if reading something beyond flesh, beyond science, beyond logic. Claire smiled softly, though her lips trembled, and whispered a truth she barely believed herself. "I think I am pregnant." Kovri tilted his head slowly, and his hand remained over her stomach. His fingers spread like a shield, as if trying to feel the life growing inside. There was no fear in his face, only calm, only acceptance. And that terrified her more than silence. She walked outside the cave that night alone for the first time in days, and stared at the endless sky, asking the stars questions she never thought she would ask. How? Why? What now? Her breath shook as she remembered the way his skin felt against hers the night they had drawn close, the warmth between them, the quiet surrender of two lost souls, finding something in each other that no language could explain. She thought it had been comfort or trust, or even loneliness, but now it was more. Now it was real. A new life was growing inside her, and she did not know if it would have her eyes or his skin, or something completely unknown. She did not know if it would survive this planet, or if she would. When she returned to the cave, Kovri was waiting with a bed of soft moss and crystal lights glowing gently around it, and he guided her to it like a ritual. She lay down with his hand still resting on her stomach, and his breath steady as stone. And something in that quiet moment made her believe that maybe this was not a curse. Maybe it was a gift. In the following days, Kovri built a new room deeper into the cave, using smooth stones and glowing roots, and he filled it with soft furs and warm crystals and small pools of fresh water. He carved symbols on the walls. Not words, but stories. Their story: a ship, a crash, to figures walking side by side, a glowing child surrounded by stars. Claire traced those carvings with her fingertips, feeling tears fall without sound, and each night she dreamed of holding something warm and small, with bright eyes that looked at her with recognition. The changes in her body grew stronger, and she began to feel the life move inside her, like fluttering wings or waves brushing against the shore. Kovri began to sing, not loudly, not with words, but deep, soft hums that echoed in her chest, and made the cave feel alive, like the planet itself was humming in harmony with them. She laughed more, cried more, slept in Kovri's arms as he kept watch through the long alien nights. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near a spring, she collapsed. Pain sharp and sudden, Kovri carried her back in silence, moving with strength and speed, and placed her on the soft bed he had prepared with care and devotion. She gripped his hand, her eyes wide with fear, and his face remained calm as he placed his other hand over her heart, and sang louder, now filling the cave with vibration and light. And then silence. The pain faded, the moment passed. Claire breathed again, and Kovri never let go of her hand. They sat there for hours, breathing, watching, waiting. Claire whispered, "I am not ready." Kovri touched her face gently, and for the first time he spoke in clear, broken human words. "You are strong." And she cried in his arms, not from fear, but from love. The wind outside the cave had shifted, and the colors of the sky had changed from burning orange to soft violet, and Claire stood at the entrance with one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, watching as two moons rose together like old friends, meeting after years of silence. Her body had grown heavier with time, and her steps were slower, but her eyes now carried something deeper than fear, something brighter than confusion. Kovri stood behind her in quiet stillness, his hands holding a long crystal rod that pulsed with gentle light, a tool from his ship, repurposed now not for battle, not for defense, but for care. Together they had created something sacred, not just a child, but a space, a bond, a future carved from the wreckage of loss and shaped by shared survival. Claire turned to him and smiled, her hand reaching for his as they walked back inside to the deep chamber that now glowed with warmth and peace. The walls were covered with new carvings, ones that showed the child in her dreams dancing under the twin moons, surrounded by stars, trees, water, and hands, both human and alien, raised in harmony. She sat down on the bed of moss, breathing slow and steady, as Kovri knelt beside her, placing stones in a circle, and lighting each one with a hum that filled the air with soft vibration. The time had come. Her body ached with pressure, and her breath grew faster, her hands clenching around his as waves of pain and life moved through her like a storm rising. From within, Kovri never looked away, his glowing eyes fixed on hers, whispering quiet notes from his world songs, meant to calm, songs meant to carry her through. The cave held its breath, the planet held its breath, and then a sound, new, soft, fragile. Alive, Claire let out a cry, not of pain but of wonder, as Kovri lifted the newborn into his arms, wrapped in soft leaves, glowing faint blue from the warmth of its skin. The child looked up with wide, dark eyes, eyes that shimmered with starlight and hope, a mix of her world and his, something never seen before on this planet or any other. Claire reached for the baby, and Kovri placed it gently into her arms, and she held the tiny life against her chest, her heart beating with love so deep. It silenced every fear she ever knew. She looked at Kovri with tears streaming down her face, and he looked at her the same way he always did. Without words but with truth, he placed a hand on the baby's head and whispered a name not in human speech, but in a sound that felt like wind over water, like light touching skin, like home. The next days passed like dreams, the cave filled with quiet laughter and soft cries, and the fire never dimmed. Kovri made toys from stone and fiber, and Claire sang songs from earth while feeding the child who slept in their arms beneath crystal lights. They taught each other little things, how to swaddle, how to soothe, how to hold without fear. One day, while Kovri carved new markings into the wall, the long-dead beacon near the ridge began to blink, a signal, faint but real. Claire stood beside him, watching the soft pulse like a heartbeat across the horizon, and her thoughts filled with possibilities she had buried long ago. Rescue, return Earth. She held the child close and looked at Kovri, who now watched her with calm understanding, as if he had already known this moment would come. She whispered, "They might come for me." Kovri nodded. Claire looked at their child, then at the cave, then at the alien who had saved her, loved her, become her world, and she shook her head. "No, they will come for us." She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation, and they stood there as one family. Not of blood, not of history, but of choice. Weeks later, a ship descended through the skies, its sleek frame landing near the valley, where the blue stones still circled the spire. Humans stepped out in uniforms with scanners and questions and disbelief in their eyes when they saw Claire and the being beside her holding a child born from stars and survival. They asked her what happened. She smiled and said, "I found life." They asked her who he was. She said, "He is the reason I am still here." When they asked about the baby, she said, "This child is hope," and that was all she needed to say. Claire chose not to return to Earth. Not yet. Not until the world was ready to understand. She stayed on the planet with Kovri and their child, and together they turned the cave into a home that welcomed more than survival. It welcomed a future, a new chapter, a story of unity written across galaxies and beneath the twin moons of a once lonely planet. A family watched the stars rise, not as strangers, but as one.